So good afternoon, good morning, and good evening. I am David Troy, co-curator of TEDxMidAtlantic, and we're thrilled to bring you another very special program today, part of a series of programs we're doing on defending democracy against unethical manipulation and undue influence. So we're living at a time where trust in facts, science, and truth is being eroded. Our first speaker and our research team calls this process Truth Decay. Jennifer Kavanagh is a researcher at the nonprofit, nonpartisan RAND Corporation, and her team has taken a broad, sweeping view of this problem and offers some ideas for what we might do about it. So welcome, Jennifer.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you. And our second speaker is Samantha North. She is a disinformation researcher at the University of Bath, and she's currently based in Lisbon. She is specifically focused on the problem of tribalism and how disinformation serves to make tribalism worse. So Samantha's going to give us a rundown of what we should know about this challenge and how we can lessen the effects of increasing tribalism in our society. Welcome, Samantha.
Thank you, Dave. Good to be here.
And so first up, we are going to hear from Jennifer. And Jennifer, give us a rundown of your work on Truth Decay.
Thanks. I'm just going to share some slides. Welcome. I'm glad you made it here. How has 2020 been for you? For most of us, it's been one heck of a year. I bet many of you, like me, are checking the news daily these days, looking for updates on the development of new vaccines that can help prevent us from getting COVID-19 and can put us back on a path towards whatever the post-COVID normal is going to look like, one that's aimed at rebuilding the economic damage and other destruction that's occurred over the past 7 months. And while many of us are waiting in hope, usually at home because of quarantine measures, the vaccines will come sooner rather than later. There are some people that fear such a vaccine, perhaps even more than they fear COVID-19 itself. For months now, we've seen and heard about protests and online communities of anti-vaxxers who rally against a coronavirus vaccine, and in fact, against vaccines in general, arguing that they're not safe, that they have higher risks than the diseases they're supposed to prevent. Some people point to specific negative health outcomes, such as the onset of conditions like autism. Others fear even worse, that vaccines are a way for government to implant chips inside of us that will control our behavior or our thoughts. Of course, anti-vaccine groups and disinformation around vaccines are nothing new in our country. There have been vaccine skeptics since there have been vaccines. You can see here an invitation to an anti-vaccination society in 1902 that strove to end compulsory smallpox vaccinations. But what's changed over time is not only the reasons why skeptics say vaccines are unsafe. Vaccine skepticism actually seems to be getting worse, increasing at the same time as we get more and more evidence telling us that vaccines are safe and low risk. Today, we know from public opinion polls that vaccine skeptics are becoming more and more distrustful of vaccines. On the right, there's a photo of an anti-vax march held here in my hometown, Washington, D.C. in 2017. And a recent Gallup poll told us that only 84% of Americans say that vaccines are important, compared to 94% who said the same thing in 2001. And unfortunately, this skepticism seems especially high around a potential COVID-19 vaccine. In September 2020, only about 1/2 of respondents in the United States said they would definitely or probably try to get a COVID vaccine once it was available. So why these trends? Well, part of the problem is the explosion of false information on the topic. Disinformation, like that surrounding vaccines, is then amplified in volume, speed, and scope in our current information ecosystem. Our information environment is bigger and more personal. Think of the changes that have happened since 1902. Radio, then movie newsreels, television, now the internet. These have allowed us to be more social and to share more information with more people. In 2017, for example, it was estimated that over 500 million tweets were sent to over 2.4 billion people per day. Social media and the algorithms that determine what information we see online also exacerbate our pre-existing cognitive biases. There are systematic errors in the way we process information and interpret the world around us. And this can influence what we see, what we focus on, and how we view things. And additionally, I'm sure you've noticed that disinformation can be fueled by partisanship and by polarization. So the disinformation challenge that we face today is not just about the information itself, and countering it is not just about editing internet content, countering false narratives, or even training students in media literacy. And this is because disinformation occurs within a system, one that we at RAND call Truth Decay. So let's have a look at how this works in general, and then we'll come back to today's anti-vaccination groups and protests. Truth decay can be defined as the diminishing role that facts, data, and analysis play in our political and civil discourse and in the policymaking process. We can define truth decay as comprising 4 trends. First, an increasing disagreement about facts and data, like we see around vaccines. Second, a blurring of the line between opinion and fact. This is anywhere that facts and opinions and even falsehoods are presented in a way that's interchangeable and makes it really difficult for the average news consumer to distinguish between the two. Third, the increasing relative volume of opinion compared to the amount of fact. When you turn on the television, when you go online, there's so much commentary that even if you're trying to find fact-based information, it can be a challenge. And finally, declining trust in institutions that used to serve as sources of trusted factual information, like the media and the government. So what we end up with is a situation in which people don't know what's true and what's not, and they don't even know where to look to make that determination. Truth decay has 4 drivers in our framework, and only one of them is specifically focused on information. First, truth decay is caused by cognitive biases that shape what we see and how we interpret information. A good example is motivated reasoning, which leads us to search for not the best information or the highest quality information, but for information that proves that we're right, that confirms our pre-existing beliefs. Second, changes in the information environment obviously play a role. We have the rise of social media and its algorithms, changes in the economics of the media industry that make producing commentary much more profitable than producing hard-hitting, fact-based investigative journalism. Also, the ease with which anyone can become a source and spread information to millions of people is a factor. Individual training and susceptibility to false and misleading narratives matter as well. Technology changes fast, but institutions like schools change slowly, and this creates a gap between the skills that people have to navigate the information environment and the complexity and challenges they face in using and mastering this new media space. And schools already have so many demands, especially in a COVID-19 context. And this only exacerbates the problem because it leaves little time for integrating new programs, new media literacy courses, civics, or other related literacies. And this says nothing about the millions of adults who are already out of school, but also lack these skills. And finally, polarization along social, economic, and political lines creates divisions that allows false narratives to thrive in these insulated and isolated communities. And it makes it increasingly difficult to change minds or correct falsehoods. The consequences of truth decay can be dire. Not only does it create uncertainty that undermines individual decision-making, but without a common set of facts, policymakers can't seriously debate policy options or tackle any of the big challenges that are facing the country or the world. Most dramatically, as we've seen in the pandemic, a failure to attend to basic fact-based information can lead to economic devastation, widespread illness, and in the extreme, even death. So now let's look at what it means for disinformation to be systemic through the lens of vaccines. Each of the drivers that I mentioned of truth decay plays a role in the power and spread of vaccine skepticism and denial. Scientific research shows that vaccine skeptics actually show different ways of processing information than non-skeptics. They have different worldviews, use different estimation techniques. They process and weigh risks differently than non-skeptics. And this means that a part of their skepticism and their denial of vaccines is a result of their mental model, their cognitive functioning, the way they see the world, and simply the way their brain works. The role played by the information system should be obvious. Social media amplifies disinformation around vaccines. And in a crowded online space, it can be really hard to disentangle good science from bad science. Celebrities and other high-profile figures can also gain an outsized influencer role compared to scientists who have that factual information. And foreign actors They identify issues like vaccines that divide Americans and exploit them to achieve their own ends. Although schools are increasingly focused on courses like media literacy to help counter conspiracies like those around vaccines, you can't gain the skills you need to navigate the new online world in one course or one module of one course. True media literacy requires an outlook change, a new way of approaching information, and efforts to advance companion literacies as well. For example, science literacy, numeracy, history, civics. These are all essential to understanding misinformation around scientific principles like vaccines, climate change, or even mask wearing. And finally, like many disinformation narratives, anti-vax attitudes thrive in insular online communities that share and reinforce a set of beliefs. Mutual confirmation allows these beliefs to grow stronger and more extreme, and for members of the community to become more and more sure they're right. And we often see overlap between those with anti-vax attitudes and those who believe in other types of conspiracies, precisely because these insulated communities pose the perfect vehicle for the spread and reinforcement of false information. So in the case of vaccines, as in so many other cases, the disinformation problem is only partly about the information and only partly about the information environment at all. Instead, it's a much more pernicious challenge that is wound into the way we think, the way we see the world, and how we interact with others. The consequences of the systemic disinformation around vaccines are severe. We've seen a resurgence of diseases that were once nearly eradicated in the United States and elsewhere. And while some claim these diseases are no big deal, this is far from true. So let me give you some examples. In 2018, there were about 10 million cases of measles worldwide, cases on every continent, and over 140,000 people died, which was an increase of over 50% over the total that died in 2016. The vaccine that helps prevent chickenpox has been publicly available in the United States since 1996. And I myself can speak to how dreadful this disease was. I had it in 1989 when I was 8. And what is usually a couple weeks of illness turned for me into about 2 to 3 months, in which I got infections in my ears when the chickenpox went inside of them. And that wasn't it. It came back again in college in the form of shingles. But despite the known pain and inconvenience of this disease and the danger it poses for some people, in 2017, the state of Minnesota reported almost 400 cases of chickenpox, most of which could have been prevented by the vaccine. And in the case of COVID-19, a failure to vaccinate most Americans will mean the continued spread of this disease, more death, economic devastation that only worsens, more lost time with family, missed milestones. The list goes on. So where do we go from here? Because this is a systemic challenge, multifaceted solutions will be required. Unwinding disinformation is not just about fact-checking, and it's not just about removing disinformation from online spaces. First, we're going to need targeted and effective communication by the right messengers that replaces false beliefs with new ones and provides information that has as much emotional resonance and relevance as false information. Second, we need new ways of presenting scientific evidence that's accessible and meaningful to non-scientists. And we need to think about how we educate all of society, not only in media literacy, but in science literacy, numeracy, and other related skills. Understanding how scientific knowledge evolves is an essential part of being able to spot false information and build resistance to conspiracies. Efforts to bridge polarized divides and establish areas of commonality and common ground will also be required to stop the spread and growth of false narratives. We know that bringing people together to discuss their differences can work to bridge these divides, but the question is how we scale that to something at the national or even global level. And finally, we need new ways of managing online spaces that reduce their vulnerability to threat and exploitation. This doesn't mean regulation, but it does mean creating rules of the road that help to safeguard what we like and value about online spaces while eliminating what we'd rather do without. Is this going to be easy? No. Is it going to be quick? Unfortunately not. But with a coordinated and multifaceted approach, we can turn things around in a way that wouldn't be possible if we focus on combating disinformation as an information-only problem, one narrative at a time. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Jennifer, for sharing that overview of your team's work. We really appreciate it. We've gotten some questions into the Q&A. I'm going to defer to answer those until after we've heard from Samantha. But Samantha, maybe you could go ahead and give us an overview of what you're seeing with respect to tribalism in society and how disinformation is affecting that problem.
Yeah, absolutely. There were some fantastic points in Jennifer's presentation and some good intersections with what I'm going to talk about. But I'm going to dive into tribalism as a specific driver of polarization and look at how that intersects with how social media platforms work. So again, let's think back to some of the major political events since 2016. We've got some obvious cases here. We've got Brexit, we've got the 2016 election of Donald Trump, and we've got the COVID-19 pandemic. So there's one thing that characterizes all of these events, and that's tribalism. And the pattern has been the same on both sides of the Atlantic. So in each of these events, the populations involved have divided themselves into quite distinct and quite aggressively opposing identity-based groups. So in the UK, we've had the Leavers versus the Remainers. In the US, we've had the Trump supporters versus the Clinton supporters. And now in the pandemic, we've got anti-maskers versus the pro-maskers. And that's just to name a few examples. So we've also seen a lot of social and political issues affected by this pattern of group conflict. So it could range from abortion rights to gun rights to things like climate change and immigration in particular. People tend to adopt the views of their primary identity group, while at the same time fiercely derogating and often insulting those members of the opposition group. For example, a common refrain is, "Do your own research, sheeple," which I've seen an awful lot at the moment on Facebook. And this feeds into an overarching global divide, which is developing between those who identify as liberal and those who identify as conservative. And most of the issues I just described fit somewhere within this broader binary. And this is problematic in a number of ways, but in particular, tribalism leads to polarized societies. And as Jennifer already described, these struggle to reach agreement on key issues that affect everyone involved. And one good case in point is the COVID-19 pandemic, which we're living right now. So in this, tribal responses have already undermined public health measures over issues like mask wearing, social distancing, the prospect of vaccinations, whether Sweden's approach is best, whether the virus is actually a hoax, and whether or not Bill Gates is to blame for everything, and so on. All of these issues have attracted a whole host of binary responses with very little room for nuance. And in real life, this has actually compelled some people, the COVID skeptics, to go out on the streets and actually protest against pandemic public health measures. And we've seen some examples of this recently, both in the US and in the UK. So to understand the problem better, let's start by taking a quick look at where tribal behavior comes from. Humans have got a natural tendency to behave tribally. It's a sort of defense mechanism, and it's left over from our evolutionary process. It's important for us to be accepted by our tribe because historically, that was always what kept us safe from potential external aggressors. If a person gets kicked out from their tribe, then they're going to be vulnerable and in danger from being attacked. In more modern life, this tendency towards tribalism is highlighted further when we look at network effects. So here we have the principle of homophily, which is illustrated by the proverb, "Birds of a feather flock together." And this dictates that people's personal networks usually contain a lot of people who are similar to them in a number of different areas, which could include race, class, socioeconomic level, perhaps their job, hobbies, or even the sports teams that they support. But in particular, and this is what we're looking at here, the kind of political views that they hold. So this desire to be accepted by the tribe or the in-group, it's problematic, but it's not actually the biggest problem that we're dealing with when we're looking at tribalism. So along with the desire for acceptance by the in-group, there comes another desire, and that's this tendency to act in a hostile manner towards the opposing tribe or the out-group. And in so doing, the individual reinforces their identity as part of their in-group. And in that way, they give themselves a self-esteem boost, which is a motivation to carry on behaving in that particular way. And on social media, where we're bombarded every day, 24/7 by tons of information, we need certain heuristics to enable us to navigate through all this information. And content that's shared by our tribe can actually be a useful shortcut for us to deciding whether we should trust it. I say useful, but that's not really accurate, because the problem is that often we can't trust it at all. So now let's take a look at how social media, tribalism, and disinformation intersect. So a lot of the problem stems from certain design features that were built into the social media platforms. And we've probably heard of echo chambers and filter bubbles. Echo chambers are formed by people gathering in groups with similar views. And filter bubbles are more towards the algorithms of the platforms, which serve up more and more content that people want and like, which then creates a tailored view of reality. And the ultimate goal of this is to keep people on the platform for as long as possible, which basically leads to more advertising revenue. So that is a simple business decision in essence, but one with far-reaching repercussions. Another important factor to consider is dopamine. Now, dopamine is a brain chemical, and it controls a variety of different behaviors, but in particular, mood, attention, and motivation. And dopamine also triggers in us a desire to seek out and search for things, in particular for information. This can lead us into dopamine loops, which have two parts. First part is wanting the reward and taking action to get to it. And the second part is the liking part, which is where we get the reward and we feel satisfied and then we stop searching. You may think that that's the end of it, but actually the wanting part of the loop is stronger than the liking part in the brain. And this can lead us into situations like the endless scrolling mode on our social media, for example, Instagram. And I think most of us have been there and done that and probably still fall into it from time to time. Another issue with dopamine is that we're constantly seeking reward through the notifications that we get from our social media apps. Whenever we log into Facebook and we see these little red notifications in the top corner, that gives us a small hit of dopamine. And because we don't know if there are going to be any notifications or how many we're going to have, it creates an asymmetric reward situation, which is addictive, like a slot machine. And we're always checking to see what's going to be there. Another behavior that can keep people trapped in dopamine loops is getting into arguments with people from the opposing groups, and that includes trolls. So in arguing about a political issue, for example, this perpetuates tribal behavior because we get rewarded through dopamine, which comes from the notifications that we receive when our opponent replies. So as you can see, there's a lot of ways that tribalism is inherent in how the social media platforms intersect with people's behaviors. So how does all this lead to greater susceptibility to disinformation? Well, people who create disinformation campaigns know all about tribalism, and they usually design their campaigns to play into existing social and political cracks. And these are usually emotive ones where people are deeply invested and their emotions and their identity and worldview is wrapped up in the topic at hand. And quite often this includes politics. So acting tribally on social media makes us more susceptible to sharing disinformation in two main ways. Firstly, we share content. Quite often we share it as a way to get one up on the outgroup. So for example, Let's imagine you were in a political argument with somebody on social media, and to prove your point and to show them that you are right, you might share a certain article with them. But often in these circumstances, we're so focused on sharing and getting our point across that we're less likely to stop and check the veracity of the piece of content that we're sharing, which can be problematic for obvious reasons. And secondly, we are more prone to sharing content that resonates with our tribe, because doing this attracts approval from them in the form of likes and comments. And this then reinforces our self-esteem and leads again to more dopamine. And finally, this is also a way to broadcast our identity as a member of that tribe, which once again attracts more approval and further cements our in-group status. So what can we do to try and become less tribal on social media? Well, some might argue that the social media platforms ought to change their designs. Now we know how problematic they can be. But since they were designed like this from the beginning, I imagine this is a significantly difficult undertaking. So I can't imagine it happening anytime soon. But in the meantime, there are a few ways that we, the ordinary social media users, can try to address the underlying factors that lead us into increased online tribalism. And I'm just going to talk through a few of those now in closing. So one important thing we can do is to try and stay out of dopamine loops and break out of them if we fall into one. So a few ways we can do this. We can make our devices less appealing. So for example, take a mobile phone, we can put it in grayscale mode instead of color, which then lessens the dopamine that comes from it. We can switch off all of our notifications, for example, or we can train ourselves to spend longer periods of time with the phone on airplane mode or simply switched off. Very practical things there. They're not magic bullets, but I think they do help get us used to this new way of interacting with those devices. Another thing we can do is to really try to avoid engaging with trolls and anyone who wants to argue. So I used to be terrible at this. I used to fall victim to troll arguments about politics quite often on Twitter and sometimes on Facebook. And then I decided that it's a complete waste of time, and in many cases, it's never going to go anywhere, and I'm never going to change the opponent's mind. So it's a fruitless endeavor. So now I just immediately mute or block the person instead of just responding in a knee-jerk way. And actually, I recommend muting them, because then they don't know you've done anything, and they just keep on probably shouting their point, but they have no idea if you're listening or not. Another very important thing to do is when a piece of political content resonates with you, before sharing it or interacting, think, why does it resonate? Take a pause and think carefully about this. Remember that everyone has confirmation biases, and when you see a piece of content that fits with your existing worldview, you're likely just to believe it, and you won't think to question whether or not it's actually true. You might not even care if it's actually true. So this is very important, because this is super easy to fall victim to. And finally, try and consider the incentives behind why someone is sharing a piece of content in the first place. Perhaps it could be part of a hidden political agenda. If the account that's sharing it is, if their history is full of highly political tweets or posts, perhaps they are there just to push a certain agenda. Perhaps they're just someone who's trolling for the fun of it. Or maybe they're trying to drive attention to their website in order to benefit from making money from online advertising. And a very famous example of this is in the 2016 US election, when the Macedonian teenagers assessed both pro-Trump and pro-Hillary content to see which was more profitable, and they found out that pro-Trump content got them the most clicks. So it was basically a business decision and nothing to do with ideology, but it had very potent effects on the US population, of course, as we know. So in closing, tribalism is inherently wrapped up in many aspects of our lives online. Social media platform design exacerbates it, and disinformation campaigns weaponize it in order to keep us divided. So we have to be aware of this and do whatever small actions we can in order to try and fight back. Thanks for listening.
Thanks so much, Samantha. I really appreciate that overview, as well as the many practical points that you offer in terms of things that people can do to be less susceptible. So I'd like to start with some of the questions that we have from our audience, but also talk about some of the broader themes that I think that we picked up in each of your talks. I think the thing that has always struck me about this problem, and full disclosure, I do a lot of personal work in this space, is the linkage between social connection and our family and friends and our social networks and our beliefs. This idea that the two are sort of in a dialectic tension with each other, and that the one informs the other, and you almost can't change your beliefs without also affecting your social network, and you can't affect your social network without also potentially influencing your beliefs to some extent. I would be interested in hearing from each of you around how you kind of perceive that problem in terms of this work. I think, Jennifer, you point out sort of the heavy lift that this, current situation is going to require in terms of addressing, sort of this problem of truth, and making sure that people are on the same page, and not having different facts. And then I think your thoughts on tribalism, Sam, I think also are sort of in this realm. So I wondered if maybe each of you could talk a little bit about the social aspects of how belief is formed and the relationship between the two.
Jennifer can go first.
Yeah, fine. That's
So I think that this is a really important question. We know from research that one of the most influential sources of information that we receive is from our friends and family and our social networks, and that information that we receive in that anecdotal fashion can really easily outweigh fact-based information. And that's because it's powerful and emotionally resonant. When you hear something from a family member, it's connected to you. When you read facts on a page, it's boring and not interesting to most people. So that disconnect, that connection goes back to what Sam was talking about with the dopamine. It's all about chemicals in your brain and how it makes you feel. And so breaking that loop is really hard. And I think that when we start talking here at RAND about solutions to truth decay, I think a lot of this comes down to individual responsibility. Part of our effort is to identify the ways in which individual action can help to change this at the small scale. So from the bottom up. So me being aware of the fact that when I hear anecdotes that are emotionally powerful, I'm going to be drawn to them, but I can't let myself get sucked into that. If I want to verify whether that one person's experience or that one person's fact is true, I have to be willing to spend the time to research that information online or at a library to find whether or not there is more generalized evidence of that. Now, this is hard because we're all busy and we all don't have time to, every time we hear something, go out and research it. So it's all about kind of figuring out what your comfort level is and like how much time you're willing to spend on seeking out these, the more generalized information. And if you don't have time to do it, just being aware that just because you heard it one time doesn't mean that it's kind of a generalized fact. And the challenge here is great. And I think that this really goes back to what Sam was talking about, that we're kind of forced to fight against our own biology. And our own biology is then being exacerbated by this online space where like the one tweet, the one piece of information we see online, that can be really influential, especially if it inspires outrage or some other kind of emotion that gets us all worked up. And so being aware that social media platforms want you to feel that outrage, because then you stay on the platform more. So being aware that both your biology and the way the online space works are working against you getting that accurate information, and kind of just constantly kind of fighting against it as you become more comfortable both understanding how your own brain works and understanding how the online environment works.
Sam, you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, I mean, it really does feel like we're fighting a losing battle on two fronts, really, isn't it? Our brains and the tech platforms that we're all interacting with. I think that, yeah, going back to what I said about how tribalism is like an evolutionary leftover, it's going to be very difficult to detach people from the beliefs of their in-group, because that's going to make them feel deep down very vulnerable. So I think I read today an interesting piece. I think it was by a writer called James Clear, and he talked about how bringing people together to share a meal or to interact in person can really help them to come together on, you know, polarized beliefs. And of course, in the social media landscape, we're completely lacking that. And I think that's one thing that makes it so challenging. But yeah, where am I going with this? Maybe more offline events that bring people together might somehow start to fix this problem. I just can't see that much progress being made when there's so much bandwidth and mental energy involved in fighting on these two different fronts. I just think maybe some people will be proactive about it, but I can't imagine that the whole, you know, the billions of people on social media will be. I think that many will still be susceptible. So it's not very optimistic, I'm afraid. There you go.
I mean, I think maybe the hope is that for those of us who didn't grow up from the start with these platforms, this is a new world, right? And we're still getting used to it, even though we've had it for 10 or 15 years. But for people who grow up as digital natives who had this from birth, that maybe the difference and being able to navigate this space is easier. There is some evidence that younger people who are more familiar with this technology are better able to disentangle fact and opinion when they're looking at online sources. So that's one possibility. Another is that building it into education, starting at, say, like preschool, means that when you actually get to adulthood, you have a whole range of skills that maybe those of us who are adults now are kind of lacking. I think that the idea of kind of bridging those divides and getting people in face-to-face situations, Sam's right, there is evidence that it works on a number of issues, polarized issues like gun control and other types of things. But my question then is, like, how do you get that to the national level? Like, it works great if I have time to, you know, I can't convene like 20-person groups all around, and then get everybody in the country or everybody in the world in them. So I think that's kind of the harder piece there, is how you scale that type of thing. And I know there are researchers working on it, so maybe we'll get there one day.
But I think part of it is being broadly aware of the nature of the problem. This is about our relationships with each other more so than necessarily our distinct beliefs. And, you know, I think that one of the reasons why the disinformation landscape has been attractive to hostile foreign enemies and various other folks who want to, you know, affect the way we perceive reality is because it's cheap to influence, you know, the information environment, and it also has lasting consequences in terms of how our social structures are wired. And that's a very attractive target, I think. I have a question here from Stephen Hassan, who is a friend of mine, who's also a you know, very well-respected expert on cults and undue social influence. And he kind of offers the idea that it's not so much that truth is decaying, it's that people's minds are being socially influenced by a variety of different campaigns. And they're using, you know, technologies like fourth generation warfare, which, you know, was described going back decades by Lind and Weyrich and, you know, various others who have done terrific writing on that. And I think that we are living in an age of influence. I think certainly Steve would suggest that we're living in an age of influence that we're kind of not acknowledging. Like, you know, we are living in this age of very high-powered propaganda being put forth from a variety of different sources. And it's not like it's all just one side or something. This is just sort of the nature of politics and news and media right now. And I feel like that nobody wants to break the fourth wall and say, well, actually, you know, we're all kind of under the influence of these very powerful influence techniques. And this is part of the reason why we're having so much trouble agreeing on what's going on, is because nobody wants to, you know, define that as where the baseline reality is. I wondered if you had thoughts on that.
Well, so I definitely agree that, you know, truth is not decaying. I do think that the use of facts is decaying. But, you know, use of fact decay does not sound catchy at all, right? So we had to get some kind of term that could encapsulate what we were trying to talk about, that people would remember, that would stick in their mind. But I definitely agree that the issue here is not necessarily truth decaying, and more something about the way we use and consume and apply factual information. And I do agree that that we get caught up into these narratives where information is put forth with no fact base at all, and where various actors make almost no attempt to ground their ideas in facts and evidence, and that people follow those ideas, whether it's because that they want to belong to some partisan group, or because they are following, they're not bothering to check it and they're just following elite cues, or they want to be like their friends. This goes back to the idea of how we relate to other people. So I do think that the extent to which we are being influenced by various sources is a really important point. But I don't think that there's just one influencer, right? You do see different narratives, competing stories, and very deep divides between the people who follow those different stories. And there's so many of those different stories. And that's part of the problem, is that anywhere I go online, I can find somebody who thinks like me on that issue, and I can become a part of that community. Now, that belonging, that ability to find a community is really powerful. And I don't want to say that it's only a bad thing, because if you think about minority groups, people who are, would otherwise be very isolated, that ability to belong is really important and a good thing. But it also has these negative consequences. And I think that's the challenge here, is that everything in the online world has a good side and a bad side. So how do we navigate that?
Well, and if I may, I mean, I think a lot of it really boils down to the belonging. One interesting article I saw last week was talking about the QAnon phenomenon, which is something that I've been doing a lot of research in. And what they found was that if you actually ask the people who claim to be, Q supporters, that sort of thing, if they believe the sort of central beliefs of the Q myth, they won't even have heard of half of them. But what they're finding is that by believing in this, myth, whatever it may be, and joining in with this research community, that they are finding connection and belonging within that construct that is in fact, the real driver of what's moving them to move in that direction. And it's this social construct more so than the belief system. And I think, you see the same thing, I think, with, religious communities sometimes, where people say, well, how can this person claim to be a Christian when they believe when they do all these things that are opposite to Christian teachings? And it's because it's social construct first, rather than necessarily being strictly about dogma. So anyway, I think that's a really interesting division. Sam, I wondered if you had thoughts on just the sort of, fourth generation warfare influence topic.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in with something that just popped into my mind when you were talking about QAnon in particular. So we're talking about truth decay and facts and the problems surrounding those, but I've noticed quite a disturbing trend. Quite often with people who are very into conspiracy theories or the whole QAnon universe, where they're using doing your own research, like as a kind of a badge of honor in a way, and they're using this as almost a weapon to attack the so-called normies, or people in the mainstream who don't subscribe to those beliefs. And in a way, I think this sort of erodes the whole concept of doing critical research, because it's been hijacked and co-opted in this sense. So I feel that might be kind of serving to devalue that concept, because critical research for many people just means going on YouTube and finding something that supports their existing beliefs. And obviously this is just perpetuating the problem. So I wanted to really highlight that, because it struck me quite often recently.
Well, yeah, no, it keeps coming up in this work that we're doing, and this idea of research leading to discovery, which in turn leads to a dopamine hit. That feeling when you get two jigsaw puzzle pieces to fit together is very addictive to people. And so the idea that they're able to do this, at scale, within the context of this QAnon game structure, and that's really what it kind of is. You'll hear more about that from us soon, but it's basically a game, and I think people find that very addictive. So we have a lot of other questions too. Too many, I think, for us to probably get to them all, but I am going to try to hit on the broad themes that people are asking about. So we hear from one person who asks about how do we bridge these divides between the tribes? It's very emotional. It's very difficult to, sometimes even broach the topics between people that are among these different tribes. There's a lot of, I think, good information on how to do this in the context of sort of cult membership. But in terms of people who are just sort of on the opposite sides of the political divides, what ideas have you guys identified as potential ways for people to start to bridge these divides?
jump in here. I just got a couple of points really. So one thing that has struck me is that arguing with people never works. Right? It's completely futile, right? There was research a few years ago about the backfire effect, which showed that when you tell somebody that their beliefs are wrong, they're just going to cling more tightly to these beliefs and they're going to get more entrenched. So that's not going to work. And that's what we do all the time online, right? We try to convince people that they're wrong and that we're right. So I think that if there was some way to, instead of like attacking people directly like this, if people somehow try to understand their points of view, I can't think of other good ways except for taking a more softly approach. I don't mean doing like what the BBC does and bringing in, you know, someone who believes in the lizard people as a valid partner for a scientist on climate change, but perhaps something less extreme but along the same lines could be useful. Again, I'm not sure how that would scale, but just throwing it out there.
No, that makes sense. Jennifer, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess I would just point to the fact that research suggests that when you take a belief away from somebody, like they're more likely to go along with it if you can replace it with something else. So a lot of times we'll go out to someone and, oh, you're wrong. This isn't true. That's much less effective than if you can say, but here's what is. The challenge, though, is the here's what is needs to be something that resonates with them as strongly as the thing you're taking away. And a lot of time people hold beliefs because it gives them something, right? It goes back to this sense of belonging, or it fits in with their perception of themselves, or it helps them to answer a complicated question, or makes them feel better about something that some uncertainty or area of discomfort in their lives. And so when you take that away, one of the reasons why the backfire effect may occur is that you're trying to take something away, so I'm going to grab it that much harder. So if we can think about that communication aspect and how we can replace a belief with a true belief that's communicated in a way that resonates. And that's what I mean by the right messengers. The right messengers vary from community to community. So for a lot of communities, having someone like me or Sam or you go in and say, you're wrong, isn't going to work, because they see you as other. They see you as on the other team. If you can find somebody that they trust, whether that's someone in their religious community or a family member or a former teacher, all of those messengers may be better at delivering that message. And so I think when we identify communities that we know are caught in spirals of disinformation, or thinking about how we can bridge that divide by identifying messengers that can kind of travel between the two spaces. And that's going to vary based on the issue and the topic. And that may be something we can scale if we can think about types of people. And so I think that's an area that's worth exploring more.
Just want to build on that a little bit quickly. Yeah, I think that's a good way. And it reminds me of things I've read about in counter-radicalization, you know, bringing in ISIS members who've renounced the group and using them to try and bring other people, to de-radicalize other people. So perhaps with QAnon, if we found some spokesperson who used to be in the group, who then had rejected it and could somehow use them as a trusted source. Because, you know, one of the features of these groups is that they have so much mistrust for the MSM, the mainstream media, that people like you and I, and, you know, probably any academic would not be considered valid by them.
No, that makes a lot of sense. So one question that's come up amongst some of our listeners is really around social media regulation, and redesigning the platforms is really kind of what that's ultimately going to boil down to. And, you know, I think, Sam, you mentioned that, you know, that's unlikely because it's such a heavy lift at this point, and, you know, it's just a big change. But I mean, realistically, I mean, what other options are there than to try to design these platforms in a way that produces the kind of society that we actually want?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very challenging without reworking the whole business model, because a private company is not going to keep going if it can't sustain itself, right? And obviously they're all based on online advertising value. So I think that's great in theory. From my standpoint, I can't imagine what it would look like, but if it could be done, you know, I think it's very necessary for sure.
Jennifer, do you have thoughts on the regulation piece?
Yeah, so I guess the way that we've been thinking about it at RAND is about media governance. So a lot of times the media regulation debate is presented in really black and white terms. Either we have regulation by the government, or we have which is often termed like a Ministry of Truth that decides what gets posted and what doesn't, or we have nothing. And I don't really think that's the right way to think about it. Like, there's a whole range of gray space options. We can think about all the different, whether you're talking about disinformation, hate speech, advertising, how we deal with privacy, how we deal with access. There's a whole range of issues. And we, as a society, have come up with ways of managing other information spaces. We have regulation that's emerged to deal with television and radio. And so thinking about, do we need a new governance model? Is it more like an antitrust type model? Is it more like we've regulated or managed other media spaces, or is it something totally new that helps us to get some, quote unquote, rules of the road? And I don't have an answer to that question because it's something that we're kind of working on. But what we're trying to do is to identify the range of different options. What's the policy space between those two extremes that I mentioned? And can we find something in the middle there where social media companies and government or policy actors or independent stakeholders can come together to come up with some kind of framework that helps to manage that space in a way that's appealing to everyone? Now, are we going to get there? I don't know. There have been some develops in the European context with rules about removing disinformation online and fines associated with that. Obviously, the legal context matters. What works in Europe may not work in the United States because of First Amendment protections. But I do think it's a policy space worth exploring. And I think the way to start exploring is to just map out what all of our options are, think about the pros and cons, and see whether one of those works or whether we throw everything out.
Thank you. Yeah. So one question that we have from our listeners, and I'm going to try to synthesize a couple of different threads since they're kind of on the same topic, is about tribalism itself, and the notion that it actually has served some evolutionary purpose for us over time, and that we trust our in-group. We don't trust these guys over here because they're trying to steal our food, that kind of thing. Are there some some potential benefits to tribalism in society, but then beyond that also, can we get to a point where we can actually, appreciate our in-group, but without having hostility towards an out-group? And, how might we sort of make peace, as it were, with tribalism and try to ward off some of the effects of disinformation on tribalism and its bad effects on society?
Well, that's a big topic. I think
in a minute or two.
Yeah, I'll try. There are some benefits. I think we mentioned the sense of belonging to certain groups can be very useful for isolated people, perhaps social people who are socially awkward in some way can find solace online with different groups, right? So that's important. I don't think tribalism in its old-fashioned sense is so harmful. It's just like someone said down here, it's amplified in the online space through all these factors that I just outlined. So that makes it like hyper-tribalism. Again, yeah, with the online space and involved, this is where it gets really tricky. So I think that's all I've got to say on that, but I'd like to hear from Jennifer.
I mean, I agree it's tricky because I think a lot of times we define our in-group in contrast to an out-group. So in order to have like a tight in-group and a real sense of belonging, we need to know what we're not. And therefore the not becomes kind of like the other. And so the two are difficult to separate. I think that one path forward could be thinking about like, how do we need to kind of appreciating differences, kind of the mentality that it's okay for other groups to be different than me. I don't need to change them. I can be happy living in kind of my communities and my groups and have these other groups coexist, that we all don't have to have the same belief structure, that we are not in competition, that communicating the idea that it's not a zero-sum game. Some games in life obviously are zero-sum, but not all games are zero-sum. And trying to think about the world in that way. But again, here we're going back to this idea of fighting against our biology and then fighting against kind of an online environment in which that outrage and that sense of us versus them gets clicks, makes money, and so is perpetuated there. So we've kind of come back to the kind of beginning, kind of these two key battles that are ongoing every time we try to think about solutions to this.
I think if it were possible to somehow break down that link between the rewards we get for out-group derogation and othering behavior, like, to me, that part is not necessarily what the social media platforms' bottom lines rely on. Perhaps it's a small part of it, but if we could somehow make it less rewarding to fight with other people online, I think that actually would go a long way towards helping with this problem. And it seems to me that's more feasible than tackling, the whole thing at the same time.
Well, in a lot of ways, this has struck me like the chemical industry in like the 1950s. There are these companies that are producing things that produce some value for society, and they're producing a tremendous amount of negative externalities. And if you actually, charged those businesses the full costs of those negative externalities, those would not be profitable businesses. So, my thinking with something like Facebook is that, if they were brought to account to manage all of the negative externalities and pay for the negative externalities they create, it may well not be a profitable business, which, could be okay. Maybe something like that should exist as a nonprofit or a very thinly profitable business, much like the grocery business is very thinly profitable. But, that doesn't fit the model of kind of what we think a Silicon Valley business looks like, and what we think of the information age businesses should look like. So, I think that there's some reckoning that we're going to have to come to in terms of how we think about those negative externalities. We've got a couple of questions that also ask questions like, with respect to the vaccine debate, is it good that we should have people just sort of going along with the program and everybody getting vaccinated just because that's what everybody else is doing? Or is there room within the construct of, the vaccine and science question for people to, at least be thinking about it critically? And how do we sort of give people that space to think critically about this question rather than just sort of going along with the crowd?
So I definitely think we have to promote critical thinking. I mean, one big piece of this whole problem is people just kind of mindlessly sharing information, not critically questioning. Anytime I see something, it must be true, that mentality. So I definitely don't want to imply that, we should just accept what we're told, that there definitely has to be questioning and critical thinking about anything that we're told by any authority. I think that the past several years have shown that we can't blindly trust. We have to be skeptical, but I don't think that means we have to be cynical. I think that for a lot of people, though, wading through medical journals and weighing medical evidence is going to be really tough. And so in those cases, I think identifying people that you do trust to do that for you, whether it's your family doctor or whether it's somebody else that you trust that has the credentials to weigh that and to use their expertise. And I think that being able to separate kind of true expertise from expertise that I got online because I searched on WebMD is really important. And this goes back to the idea of kind of what is research. So I definitely think critical thinking is important, but I think in a lot of cases when we're dealing with issues that are outside of our realm of expertise, we may need to refer to other experts, even as a researcher, even as a smart person. I can read medical journals, but I'm not going to kind of take my own opinion over my doctor's. I may get a second opinion from another doctor, but again, I'm deferring to that external expertise because I can't know everything and none of us can. And so I think there's a balance between that value of expertise and your own personal critical thinking.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And I think that part of the reason why, it's challenging for, people to individually think critically about everything is that they just don't have that expertise. They don't have, the domain knowledge to be able to evaluate some things. And so we end up using our social networks and the people that we trust and identify with as a proxy for that. And we just have to, I think, accept the fact that most people are going to do that most of the time. And, try to figure out how to balance that with, people's need to think critically and to, govern themselves accordingly. So I know some of you have to hop off. I don't know if we can maybe go another 5 minutes with Sam and Jennifer. Happy to try to answer a couple more questions. We've got a whole lot, so we can't answer, get to everybody's, unfortunately, but I am trying to synthesize questions from the people who have posted them here. So one person asks about whether we are becoming actually anti-rational in our society, and whether and what solutions there are to sort of combating that.
That's a tricky one. I think to an extent, yes, although the people who are behaving in an anti-rational way would argue that they are the ones who are thinking critically, right, and who are challenging the mainstream. Something else I wanted to point out in the last question was that trust in experts has broken down. I don't know how the situation is in the US, but in the UK, even some government figures have tried to instill this mindset of not trusting expertise. And that to me is very concerning. And I'm seeing that to an extent with the Trump government as well. You know, like Anthony Fauci is being completely dismissed, and he's the subject of many conspiracy theories. So this is extremely harmful.
Well, and I think he's also been used as a kind of a character in some of these very specific disinformation campaigns, which, you know, a lot of times these campaigns are not mounted because they actually believe these things. They are mounted because they are effective weapons at dividing people. So, yeah, I think, you know, Dr. Fauci, you know, certainly has said that if there's a vaccine, he'll take it because it'll more than likely be clinically safe. So let's see, we got a lot of other questions here. There's questions about, you know, whether government is the right seat for something, you know, like a regulatory kind of an approach. I know that Carol Cadwalader has recently started a group that is what she's calling sort of the real Facebook oversight board, which is external people, not people that the company is appointed and is paying to actually oversee, you know, what Facebook is up to. What are your thoughts on what the role of government should be in sort of managing this set of problems, or whether we should try to do it externally with NGOs and other kinds of entities?
I mean, I think there are pros and cons to any approach. One approach is obviously allowing social media companies to regulate themselves. That was sort of the first approach, and it obviously has the advantage of allowing free markets and, you know, limiting regulation, but it has a number of problems. They don't have the incentive to actually regulate themselves, so that creates that issue. When we get into the idea of relying on government, they actually can impose penalties, so they do have the teeth that you would need to actually enforce something. But on the other hand, there are legitimate questions about whether or not we want those types of decisions in the hands of political actors. Especially in the United States, there's concern because right now our political system is so polarized. What happens when we switch from one party to the other? Are there wild swings in policy? Does this then give different political actors incentives to manipulate online space? So we end up with an environment that's actually unfree and that's filled with information that's being skewed in a political fashion by one party or the other party or both parties. So there's, you know, legitimate concern about whether or not these are things that should be in the hands of the government. Also concerned about freedom of speech, although, you know, Twitter can decide what they want to allow on their platform. The government, there's strict boundaries around what they can decide to remove themselves. So there's a whole range of First Amendment questions that have to be answered and addressed. And then if we're going to rely on NGOs, they avoid the problem of First Amendment, they potentially avoid the problem of incentives, but do they then have the teeth to actually enforce anything? And we see that with a number of other multilateral bodies where, you know, they can issue statements, resolutions, or decisions, but that doesn't mean that anyone's bound by them. And so if we use NGOs, if we use third-party groups, how do we make sure that those groups, if they have the benefit of objectivity and being outside, hopefully, but they may not have the ability to bind the people, the actors they're actually trying to regulate. So I think that you know, one potential solution is that it's kind of a mix of all three of those. I don't know. And this is why, though, I think that this is such an important and interesting topic to kind of map the space. What are all the things we could do, and how can we then balance them? And I don't think anyone's we tend to kind of run to our corners of like, yes, regulation, no regulation, and
it's
not
probably
actually
all the above. Yeah.
And not have this kind of deep discussion about how complicated it is. And so I think that's the space I want to live in. So.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I know that also the effort that Roger McNamee and Tristan Harris have undertaken to do the Facebook ad boycott has been, I think, somewhat effective in terms of getting large advertisers who, just simply do not approve of Facebook's business practices to band together and agree that they're not going to buy, ads on Facebook until some of their demands are met. And I think that that's, a reasonable approach. But yeah, we've gotten ourselves into kind of a corner with this. So I'd like to try to wrap up. I think what I'm hearing from some of the listeners is that, we have this innate drive to connect and to build community, and that's a really good thing. That, we don't have to necessarily think of our tribal tendencies as a bad thing, but it's when we start to demonize others, and when that tendency towards community gets weaponized, that we really start to have a problem. And I think also that, we weren't necessarily built initially for this networked age that we now inhabit, where, community is kind of fuzzy, and we've got a lot of external information coming into our information environments that we maybe wouldn't have had, centuries ago. I wonder if you have thoughts on how we can reconcile the positive sides of community and the very human need that we have for that with this kind of technological age, and how we might move forward, given balancing those distinct realities.
So I'll start. I don't have a great answer or
it's
really
a hard problem.
I don't have a satisfying answer, but what I can look to is to think back over history a little bit. So, we've had other times in history that have looked similar to this in terms of an infusion of a new information technology that's caused a lot of chaos. Chaos in terms of our social norms and our political structures, trust, the spread of disinformation. You could think back to the spread of yellow journalism, the rise of radio in the 1930s, even the television, when television became ubiquitous in the 60s and early 70s. And in all of these periods, we saw this period of dislocation, and then gradually society adjusted to having this new technology, and it didn't have the same kinds of significant negative externalities. They were either absorbed, or we developed systems to deal with them, or we adjusted, we got used to having them. We became better at integrating them into our lives in a more productive way. We've seen, even since we had online technologies, we've seen online spaces evolve from MySpace and AOL Messenger to Twitter and Facebook. And so I think that understanding it in the trajectory of time, like, these technologies are still pretty new. And so I don't, it's kind of a hope. And I think that we're still trying to understand some of these historical dynamics that have allowed past periods to move forward. But one hope is that as we get more used to these technologies, as we build systems and mechanisms to deal with them, to govern them, to integrate them, we'll be better able to balance the human connection side and the technology side. And that this period, you might think of it as like your teenage years. Teenage years are liminal and messy, yep. And you eventually get out of them. And I guess that's how I'm kind of that's one model, and kind of my hope. So.
Yeah, I think I feel the same.
I agree with you. Can I just jump in a bit?
Yeah,
there?
Please, Sam.
I think that just reflecting on my own experience with social media, I was on it in 2007, I believe, and I didn't notice a lot of these behaviors, these toxic behaviors, happening until 2014, 15. It seems like they're a very recent development, and I think that's something worth mulling over in more detail. But again, I don't have a great answer to this either, but I would like to see some ways to sort of detach personal identity from the social media environment, like less of these tailoring of reality. I think that's so harmful, because people live in these echo chambers, and they have no idea of what goes on outside. It's like when the Brexit vote happened, people like me thought that everyone around us was going to vote to remain, and we were shocked that other people were different to us. Perhaps one thing would be if there was a way to reward tolerance and reasoned debate instead of rewarding these toxic and hostile behaviors, and on top of that, finding some ways again to encourage offline cohesion, and perhaps starting a trend for digital detox and less time online. That's all I got, really.
Yeah, I think to your point about rewarding reasoned debate, one thing I notice in Facebook groups is that the most toxic content always floats to the top, and that's by design. That's how that platform works.
Yeah.
And, that kind of a simple change of just, not doing that would be a good step in the right direction. So we're going to go ahead and wrap up. I do appreciate both of you for being here and for all of our listeners and their great questions. I apologize that we weren't able to get to all of them, but I tried to, as best we could, synthesize many of your points and to cover as much terrain as we can. This program will be made available online probably in the next day or so. We are going to be doing some more content on this general theme prior to the election, so please stay posted to our mailing list and our website for additional programs within this framework. And again, thank you all for being here. We'll see you next time.